December wind cut through the Montana mountains like broken glass, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else Marcus couldn't name. He pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders as he watched his German shepherd, Ranger, stumble through the drifts beside their remote cabin. The dog's breathing had grown labored over the past week. His once proud gait reduced to careful, measured steps that spoke of deep pain and growing weakness. Marcus had seen enough wounded soldiers to recognize the signs of something serious, something that went beyond the arthritis they'd both learned to live with through their shared years of recovery. The nearest veterinarian was 40 miles through treacherous mountain roads, and with the storm system moving in from the northwest, that journey seemed impossible for both man and beast. Yet Ranger's dark eyes held a determination that Marcus recognized from their years together. First in the deserts overseas, then in these quiet mountains where they both sought refuge from memories that never quite faded into manageable shadows. The dog paused at the edge of the tree line, his nose lifted to catch something on the wind that only he could detect. His entire body suddenly alert despite the obvious discomfort that had been plaguing him for days. Marcus had adopted Ranger 3 years ago from a military working dog retirement program, both of them carrying invisible wounds from their service that civilian life seemed unable to heal completely. The dog had been a bomb detection specialist, his keen senses having saved countless lives before an IED explosion left him with nerve damage and an early retirement that ended a distinguished career in explosive ordnance detection. They'd found solace in each other's company, two veterans learning to navigate civilian life in the isolation of the Montana wilderness, where the silence felt safer than the chaos of populated areas. Marcus worked odd jobs in the nearby town of Cedar Falls, enough to keep them fed and warm through the harsh winters that tested both their resolve and their aging bodies. Their routine was simple but meaningful: morning walks along the mountain trails when weather permitted, evenings by the crackling fire with Ranger's head resting on Marcus' feet, and the comfortable silence that comes between those who understand suffering without need for words or explanations. But now, watching Ranger's labored breathing create small clouds in the frigid air, Marcus felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had haunted him since losing his squad leader to friendly fire 5 years ago. A tragedy that had ended his own military career and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about loyalty and survival. Ranger suddenly lifted his head with more energy than Marcus had seen in days. His ears perked toward the dense forest behind their cabin with an intensity that reminded Marcus of the dog's working days. The German shepherd took a few tentative steps toward the tree line, then turned back to Marcus with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency and pleading. Marcus had learned to trust Ranger's instincts completely during their time together, understanding that the dog's senses far exceeded his own in ways that had practical and sometimes life-saving applications, and his keen hearing had alerted Marcus to a bear near their property line more than once during the summer months. But this was different, more intense and focused than his usual alertness to wildlife or weather changes. Ranger's body language suggested had detected something specific, something important enough to overcome his obvious discomfort and the fatigue that had been weighing him down. The dog took another step toward the forest, then sat down heavily in the snow, his breathing visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the cold air. His dark eyes remained fixed on Marcus with an expression that seemed to communicate something beyond the usual requests for food, walks, or simple companionship that had defined their relationship since the early days of their partnership. Against his better judgment and concerns about Ranger's deteriorating condition, Marcus decided to follow his companion's lead, trusting in the bond they'd forged through years of shared solitude and mutual healing. He gathered a small pack with bottled water, a powerful flashlight, his cell phone despite knowing the signal was unreliable this deep in the mountains, some basic first aid supplies, and a handful of rangers' treats in case the journey proved too strenuous for the ailing dog. Ranger struggled to his feet with obvious effort, his hind legs trembling slightly from the exertion, but his determination remained unwavering as he led Marcus into the forest along what appeared to be an old deer trail that Marcus had never noticed despite 3 years of exploring these mountains. The snow crunched beneath their feet with each step, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees in a rhythm that reminded Marcus of marching cadences from his military days. The dog moved slowly but purposefully, stopping frequently to rest while keeping his nose to the wind, testing the air for scents that remained invisible and meaningless to his human companion, but clearly held profound significance for his 9 senses. Marcus found himself remembering their training exercises overseas, how Ranger would methodically search areas for hidden threats, his every movement deliberate and focused on a mission that could mean the difference between life and death for everyone involved. The trail led them up a steep incline that had both man and dog breathing hard, though for vastly different reasons that reflected their individual struggles with age and injury. Marcus' legs burned from the unaccustomed climb, his own service-related injuries making themselves known through sharp pains that shot up his spine with each upward step. Meanwhile, Ranger's labored breathing seemed to worsen with each step forward, his tongue hanging out despite the cold air, his gait becoming increasingly unsteady as they gained altitude. Several times, Marcus considered turning back, worried that he was pushing his sick companion too hard and potentially endangering the dog's life for what might be nothing more than a confused animal's wandering instincts. But each time he paused and suggested they return home, Ranger would look back at him with those intelligent brown eyes, somehow conveying that this journey was absolutely necessary, that whatever lay ahead was worth the struggle and the risk they were both taking. The dog's determination reminded Marcus of the soldiers had served with, men and women who pushed through pain and exhaustion because the mission came first, because sometimes the most important objectives required sacrifices that couldn't be fully understood until after the fact. He began to understand that this wasn't just a walk in the woods for Ranger, this was something the dog felt compelled to do, driven by instincts or memories that Marcus couldn't fully comprehend, but had learned to respect through years of partnership. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they climbed higher, with exposed granite formations jutting through the snow like sleeping giants that had been carved by centuries of weather and geological forces. Ranger navigated these obstacles with surprising agility despite his deteriorating condition, following a path that seemed to exist only in his mind, guided by scents and sounds that remained completely invisible to his human companion, but clearly formed a map of some kind in the dog's consciousness. The forest around them grew denser and more primeval, with ancient pines towering overhead like cathedral spires that filtered the gray afternoon light into shifting patterns of shadow and illumination. Marcus found himself thinking about the stories his grandfather had told him as a child, tales of animals that could sense things beyond human understanding, creatures whose instincts connected them to mysteries that rational minds couldn't explain or dismiss. The cold was becoming more intense as they gained elevation, and Marcus worried about both their ability to make it back down the mountain before dark and Ranger's capacity to complete whatever mission had driven him to begin this journey. Yet something about the dog's focused determination convinced him to continue, to trust in a wisdom that transcended his own understanding of what was possible or reasonable. After nearly 2.5 hours of steady climbing that tested both their endurance and their commitment to this mysterious quest, they reached a small clearing where the trees gave way to a natural amphitheater of stone formations that seemed almost deliberately arranged. Here, The wind howled more fiercely, carrying with it the sharp bite of approaching snow and the promise of a storm that could trap them on the mountain if they didn't find shelter soon. Ranger paused at the edge of the clearing, his body trembling not just from cold, but from something that looked almost like excitement mixed with a profound sense of recognition. Marcus followed the dog's unwavering gaze to where the mountainside curved inward, forming what appeared to be a cave entrance that was partially hidden by fallen rocks and winter brush, nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and would have been completely overlooked by casual hikers or hikers who might pass through this area during better weather. Ranger approached the cave mouth with renewed energy that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his failing body, his tail actually wagging slightly despite his obvious fatigue and the labored breathing that had marked their entire journey. He sniffed around the entrance thoroughly, his nose working overtime to process information that his human companion couldn't access, then looked back at Marcus with an expression that seemed to say with absolute clarity, "This is it. This is what we came for. This is where we needed to be." Marcus retrieved his flashlight and carefully squeezed through the narrow cave entrance, surprised to discover that the passage opened dramatically into a much larger chamber beyond the initial restriction. The air inside was cold but remarkably still, protected from the bitter wind that raged outside with increasing intensity, creating a natural shelter that felt almost welcoming after the harsh conditions they'd endured during their climb. His flashlight beam revealed smooth stone walls that showed unmistakable signs of human occupation, evidence that someone had used this space for extended periods. The carefully constructed remains of an old fire pit, some rusty but organized camping equipment, and what appeared to be personal belongings that had been scattered around the cave floor with the deliberate arrangement of someone who had lived here, rather than simply sheltered temporarily. Ranger limped into the chamber behind him with obvious effort, but immediately moved toward a corner where several items had been very carefully arranged on a natural stone shelf that seemed to have been chosen specifically for its accessibility and protection from moisture. Marcus approached cautiously, his light revealing a collection of military items that made his heart race with recognition and growing amazement. Dog tags that caught the light with their familiar metallic gleam, photographs that showed the weathering of age and careful handling, letters that had been wrapped in protective plastic, and a journal that appeared to have been sealed in waterproof material with the attention to detail that spoke of military training and long-term planning. The dog tags belonged to someone named James Jimmy Patterson, with service dates and identification numbers that placed his military career during the same global conflict that Marcus had fought in, though clearly in a different theater of operations that had presented its own unique challenges and tragedies. The photographs, when Marcus examined them more closely with his flashlight, showed a young soldier with bright, hopeful eyes standing beside a German shepherd that bore such a striking resemblance to Ranger that Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Both the soldier and the dog were posed against desert terrain that looked hauntingly familiar to Marcus, bringing back memories of his own deployments and the bonds had formed with both human and animal companions in those faraway places where survival often depended on trust that went beyond words or rational explanation. Marcus' hands shook slightly as he carefully opened the journal, finding page after page of entries written in neat, military-style handwriting that spoke of promises made, guilt carried, and a secret that had eaten away at the author for years after his return to civilian life. The early entries were optimistic, full of plans for the future and gratitude for surviving when so many others hadn't. But as Marcus continued reading, he could trace the deterioration of hope and the growing weight of obligations that felt impossible to fulfill. The journal entries told a story that made Marcus' chest tighten with recognition, and a grief that felt personal and universal to anyone who had served in combat zones. Jimmy Patterson had served as a military dog handler, partnered with a German shepherd named Max, who had saved his unit multiple times through expert detection of explosive devices that would have claimed countless lives, if not for the dog's keen senses and unwavering dedication to his job. During their final deployment together, Max had been severely injured in an explosion that also wounded several soldiers in their convoy, an incident that Jimmy described in agonizing detail as he relived the moments when everything went wrong despite all their training and preparation. The veterinary facilities in their area of operations were completely overwhelmed with casualties, both human and animal, and the difficult decision was made to euthanize Max rather than allow him to suffer through injuries that could not be properly treated under battlefield conditions. Unable to bear the thought of his partner and closest companion suffering, Jimmy had agreed to the decision, but had made a solemn promise to Max in those final moments that he would find the dog's offspring and ensure they received the care, respect, and peaceful retirement that Max had been denied in his final moments. The entries revealed Jimmy's growing obsession with this promise after returning home, his relationships with family and friends deteriorating as he struggled with survivor's guilt and the overwhelming feeling that had betrayed the most loyal companion he had ever known by agreeing to end Max's life when the dog might have, with medical attention. As Marcus continued reading by the light of his flashlight, with Ranger settled beside him, as if the dog understood that his mission was nearly complete, the journal revealed Jimmy's painstaking efforts to track down Max's offspring through military records and breeding programs. The final entries described his discovery that Max had indeed been bred before their final deployment, and that several of his offspring were serving as military working dogs in various capacities around the world. One of these dogs, a male named Ranger who bore his father's keen intelligence and dedication to explosive detection work, had been scheduled for early retirement due to nerve damage from an explosion that was remarkably similar to the one that had claimed Max's life years earlier. Jimmy had made contact with the military working dog retirement program, working through a complex network of veterans organizations and military bureaucracy, to ensure that he would be able to adopt Ranger when the dog's active service ended. The entries revealed months of paperwork, medical evaluations, and psychological assessments as Jimmy prepared to welcome Max's son into his home and provide the peaceful retirement that he felt he owed to his old partner's memory. But as Marcus read deeper into the journal, he could see that Jimmy's mental health had begun to deteriorate rapidly after his discharge from active duty, the combination of post-traumatic stress and crushing guilt overwhelming his ability to function effectively in civilian life or maintain the stability that would be required to care for a retired military working dog. The entries became increasingly desperate and disjointed as Jimmy's condition worsened, describing his growing isolation in this mountain cave, his inability to trust the military bureaucracy to properly place Ranger with someone who would understand the dog's value and the weight of the promises that had been made to his father, and his increasing certainty that he would never be mentally or emotionally stable enough to provide the kind of home that Max's son deserved after years of faithful service to his country. The writing revealed a man torn between his determination to keep his promise and his realistic assessment of his own limitations, someone who understood that his good intentions might not be enough to provide the care and stability that Ranger would need during his retirement years. The final entries, dated almost exactly 3 years ago, expressed Jimmy's painful decision to end his own suffering, while simultaneously ensuring that the information about Ranger's lineage and the promise had made would somehow find its way to someone who could fulfill the obligation that had failed to complete through his own actions. Marcus realized with growing amazement and a sense of profound connection that Jimmy had somehow arranged for him to adopt Ranger, working through intermediaries in the Veterans Administration and retirement programs to ensure that the dog would find a home with someone who would understand both the inherent value and the weight of the promises had been made to fallen comrades in moments of crisis and loss. The cave held much more than just Jimmy's journal and personal effects, revealing the extent of his preparation and his deep understanding of what would be required to properly care for a retired military working dog. Marcus discovered a carefully maintained cache of supplies that had been organized with military precision, including specialized medical equipment that had been specifically chosen for treating military working dogs and addressing the unique health challenges that these animals often faced after years of service in harsh and dangerous conditions. There were antibiotics that were still sealed in their original packaging, pain medications that had been stored in climate-controlled containers, surgical tools that showed signs of careful maintenance and cleaning, and detailed veterinary manuals that suggested Jimmy had spent months or even years training himself to provide medical care for his future canine companion. Among these supplies, Marcus found medications and treatment protocols that were exactly what Ranger needed for his current condition, along with detailed instructions written in Jimmy's careful handwriting that described symptoms that were identical to what Ranger had been experiencing over the past several days. It became overwhelmingly clear that Jimmy had somehow anticipated this exact moment, knowing that Ranger would eventually lead someone back to this place when the dog needed help that couldn't be found through conventional veterinary care or the limited resources available in their remote mountain location. The medications were still completely viable, having been properly stored in the cave's consistent temperature and protected from the moisture and temperature fluctuations that would have degraded their effectiveness over time. The instructions were detailed enough for someone with basic military first aid training to administer them safely, complete with dosage calculations based on the dog's weight and condition, potential side effects to monitor, and step-by-step procedures for providing supportive care during the recovery process. Marcus felt a profound sense of being guided by forces that transcended his understanding, as if Jimmy's spirit had orchestrated this entire sequence of events to ensure that his promise would finally be fulfilled through the actions of another veteran who would understand the sacred nature of the bond between soldier and working dog. The timing was too precise to be explained by coincidence or luck. Ranger's sudden illness, his mysterious determination to reach this specific location, and the presence of exactly the right medical supplies suggested a connection between past and present that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about the nature of promises, memory, and the bonds that transcend death itself. As he began to understand the full scope of what Jimmy had planned and prepared for, Marcus felt both humbled by the sacrifice and honored to be chosen as the instrument through which this long overdue promise would finally be kept. Marcus carefully gathered the medications and began treating Ranger according to Jimmy's detailed instructions, amazed at how quickly and dramatically the dog responded to the treatment that had been waiting in this mountain cave for exactly this moment. Within the first few hours, Ranger's breathing improved noticeably, the labored panting that had worried Marcus for days giving way to deeper, more regular breaths that spoke of genuine relief from whatever had been affecting his respiratory system. The dog's energy began to return gradually but steadily, his eyes growing brighter and more alert, his tail beginning to wag with something approaching his old enthusiasm when Marcus spoke to him or offered the treats from his pack. As they prepared to leave the cave after spending the night sheltered from a fierce mountain storm, Marcus made a decision that felt both natural and inevitable, as if the entire experience had been leading him toward this moment of clarity and purpose. He would take responsibility not only for Ranger's immediate health crisis, but for carrying forward Jimmy's unfulfilled promise to honor military working dogs and their handlers, expanding the mission to include all the forgotten heroes who had served alongside human soldiers in conflicts around the world. The cave would become a memorial to Jimmy Patterson and his partner Max, but more importantly, it would serve as the foundation for something much larger, a sanctuary and support system that could help other veterans and their canine companions find the healing and purpose that had been so elusive for Jimmy during his final years. Marcus began planning immediately, his military training and organizational skills coming to the forefront as he envisioned how he could use the resources Jimmy had gathered, combined with his own veterans' benefits and the connections he still maintained within the military community, to create a comprehensive sanctuary for retired military working dogs and their handlers. He imagined a place where these heroes could receive the specialized medical care they deserved, where their human partners could visit and find peace in the company of others who understood the unique bonds forged in combat, and where the promises made in moments of crisis could be honored and maintained long after the uniforms were stored away and the active duty assignments became memories. The idea filled him with a sense of purpose and direction that he hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a mission that seemed to combine healing for his own psychological wounds with meaningful service to others who shared similar struggles with the transition to civilian life. He could see how Jimmy's careful preparation and sacrifice could become the seed for something that would help hundreds or even thousands of veterans and their animal companions, transforming one man's inability to fulfill his promise into a legacy that would ensure such promises were never forgotten or abandoned again. Over the following weeks, as Ranger's health continued to improve dramatically under the treatment regimen Jimmy had prepared, Marcus began reaching out to other veterans in the Montana area and beyond, sharing Jimmy's story with careful attention to the man's memory and the lessons that could be learned from his struggle and sacrifice. The response was overwhelming and deeply moving, with veterans from across the state and eventually the entire country reaching out to offer support, share their own stories of beloved animal companions, and express interest in being part of whatever Marcus was building in Jimmy's memory. Local businesses in Cedar Falls and the surrounding communities donated supplies, expertise, and volunteer hours, understanding that this project represented something much larger than simple animal welfare or veterans services. It was about honoring the often overlooked bonds that had sustained soldiers through impossible circumstances, recognizing that the healing process for many veterans was incomplete without acknowledgement and care for the animals who had served alongside them and shared their most dangerous and traumatic experiences. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing movement, connected to a community of people who understood both the weight of promises made to fallen comrades and the profound healing power that could come from caring for creatures who had shared their darkest moments and somehow survived to tell the tale. The transformation of Jimmy's cave into a proper memorial took months of careful planning and hard physical labor, but Marcus felt Jimmy's presence guiding every decision and supporting every challenge they encountered along the way. They installed a weatherproof entrance that would allow easy access for visitors while preserving the natural character of the site and protecting the interior from the harsh mountain weather that had nearly claimed Marcus and Ranger during their first visit. Solar panels provided reliable power for proper lighting and a small refrigeration unit that could maintain medical supplies at the correct temperature, ensuring that Jimmy's cache of veterinary medications could be expanded and maintained for future emergencies. The memorial wall featured carefully preserved photographs of Jimmy and Max alongside dozens of other military working dog teams whose stories had been contributed by veterans who visited the site, creating a growing archive of service and sacrifice that honored both human and animal heroes whose contributions had often been forgotten or minimized in official military histories. But the real work was happening in the valley below, where Marcus had used Jimmy's inheritance money and his own savings to purchase a significant tract of land that would become the foundation for a proper sanctuary facility designed specifically for retired military working dogs and their handlers. The sanctuary construction project became a community effort that brought together veterans, local contractors, veterinary professionals, and countless volunteers who contributed their time and expertise to create something truly special and meaningful. The main facility was designed to provide specialized veterinary care that addressed the unique health challenges faced by military working dogs, from combat-related injuries and trauma to the age-related conditions that affected these animals as they moved through their retirement years. The rehabilitation services included both physical therapy for dogs dealing with mobility issues and behavioral support for animals who struggled with the transition from active duty to civilian life, often mirroring the challenges faced by their human counterparts in adapting to peacetime routines and environments. The peaceful environment of the Montana Valley provided an ideal setting where these animals could live out their retirement years with the dignity and respect they had earned through their service, surrounded by rolling pastures, clean mountain air, and the constant presence of people who understood and appreciated their contributions to military operations around the world. Handler visits were not only encouraged but became an essential part of the sanctuary's mission, as many veterans discovered that caring for these dogs provided a form of therapy and purpose that traditional counseling and medical treatment had failed to deliver effectively. Marcus often brought visitors to Jimmy's cave, sharing the story of how Ranger's mysterious illness and subsequent recovery had led them to discover not just life-saving medication, but a calling that had transformed both their lives and the lives of countless others who had become part of their growing community. He would describe in detail the morning when Ranger first showed signs of serious illness, how the dog's determination to reach the cave had seemed almost supernatural in its intensity and focus, and how the precisely timed discovery of Jimmy's preparations had saved Ranger's life, while opening the door to a mission that neither of them could have imagined when they first set out into the mountain forest. Veterinary experts who examined both Ranger and Jimmy's medical preparations confirmed that without the specialized medications found in the cave, the dog would have died within days of showing the first symptoms, making the timing of their discovery not just fortunate, but genuinely miraculous in its precision. The veterinarians had stopped trying to explain the coincidence rationally, instead focusing their attention on documenting Jimmy's treatment protocols and expanding them into a comprehensive medical program that could serve the needs of military working dogs throughout their retirement years. The sanctuary grew steadily over the following years, eventually housing dozens of retired military working dogs whose stories of service and sacrifice filled volumes of carefully maintained records that served both historical and practical purposes. Each animal had their own unique narrative of service in different conflicts and locations around the world, their own specific medical needs and behavioral challenges, and their own relationship with the human handlers who had shared their most intense and dangerous experiences. The handlers who visited the sanctuary often stayed much longer than they had originally planned, finding in the peaceful mountain setting and the company of fellow veterans a sense of healing and belonging that had eluded them since returning from their deployments overseas. Many became regular volunteers, their expertise in working with military dogs proving invaluable in caring for animals who shared their understanding of service, loyalty, discipline, and the psychological costs of extended exposure to combat conditions. The sanctuary became a place where both human and animal veterans could find purpose and healing together, working side by side to ensure that the bonds forged in wartime could continue to provide strength and meaning in peacetime. The success of the Montana sanctuary drew attention from military officials and veterans organizations who had previously been skeptical of civilian-run programs for military animals, concerned about maintaining the standards and protocols that these specialized working dogs required during their retirement years. Marcus found himself regularly testifying before congressional committees about the need for better transition services for both human and animal veterans. His presentations always accompanied by Ranger at his side as a living example of the healing and purpose that could result from properly honoring the promises made to military working dogs and their handlers. His testimony helped secure federal funding for similar sanctuary programs across the country, creating a network of facilities that could serve the needs of retired military working dogs regardless of where their handlers chose to settle after completing their service. The bond between the aging German Shepherd and his veteran handler had become symbolic of something much larger than their individual story of survival and recovery, representing the possibility of redemption, the power of promises kept even decades after they were made, and the profound healing that could come from transforming personal pain and loss into service to others who shared similar wounds and struggles. Marcus often reflected during quiet moments at the sanctuary about how dramatically different his life might have been if Ranger hadn't led him into those mountains on that cold December day when everything had seemed hopeless and without direction. The isolation and purposelessness that had defined his first years after leaving military service had been completely replaced, and that gave deep meaning to both his struggles with civilian life and so many of his fellow soldiers had not ridden home from their home and from their returned deployments. The sanctuary had become more than just a retirement home for military working dogs. It was a living memorial to all the promises made in moments of crisis, a place where the bonds between soldiers and their animal companions could be honored and maintained long after the immediate dangers had passed. The work provided daily proof that healing was possible, that purpose could be found in service to others, and that the weight of survivors' guilt could be transformed into motivation for ensuring that no promise made to a fallen comrade would ever be forgotten or abandoned again. The sanctuary also evolved into an important training ground for the next generation of military working dog handlers, with Jimmy's detailed notes and Marcus' practical experience forming the foundation of a comprehensive curriculum that honored the traditions and protocols of military service, while incorporating the latest advances in animal psychology, veterinary medicine, and trauma recovery techniques. Young soldiers would visit the sanctuary before their first deployments, learning from retired handlers about the profound bonds they would form with their canine partners and the responsibility to extend far beyond their active service years into retirement and civilian life. The training program emphasized that adopting a military working dog after retirement was not simply about providing a home for an aging animal, but about accepting responsibility for carrying forward the legacy of service that these creatures embodied and ensuring that their contributions to military operations would be remembered and honored throughout their lives. Marcus watched with deep pride and satisfaction as handlers who had initially struggled with the challenges of civilian life found new purpose in mentoring these younger soldiers, their hard-won experience with trauma and recovery proving invaluable in preparing others for the psychological and emotional challenges they would face during and after their service. As Marcus himself aged and began planning for the sanctuary's long-term future, he worked with lawyers and veterans organizations to create legal documents and organizational structures that would ensure the facility would continue operating long after his own passing. The legal frameworks were necessarily complex, but the underlying spirit remained beautifully simple. The sanctuary would remain permanently dedicated to serving military working dogs and their handlers, with Jimmy Patterson's cave serving as the spiritual and historical center of the entire operation. Ranger, now well into his senior years, but still remarkably healthy thanks to ongoing treatment based on Jimmy's original medical protocols, continued to serve as an unofficial ambassador for the program, his calm and dignified presence helping nervous new handlers bond with their canine partners and providing living proof that the sanctuary's mission was both necessary and successful. The dog's continued good health remained a source of wonder for the veterinary staff, who had expanded Jimmy's treatment regimens into comprehensive protocols that were now being used by military veterinarians around the world to care for aging working dogs in all branches of the service. The story of the sanctuary and its origins in Jimmy's promise to his fallen partner Max spread far beyond the military community, inspiring similar programs for other types of service animals and their handlers throughout law enforcement, fire services, search and rescue operations, and other fields where the bonds between humans and working animals created obligations that extended beyond the end of active service. Police departments began developing their own transition programs based on the model that Marcus and his team had created and refined over years of practical experience, while firefighters and emergency responders established support networks for handlers whose animal partners had been injured or killed in the line of duty. The core principles remained consistent across all these applications, honoring the bonds formed through shared service and sacrifice, providing specialized care that acknowledged the unique needs of working animals, and creating supportive communities where handlers could find understanding, purpose, and healing among others who shared their experiences and understood the weight of the promises they had made to their animal partners. Marcus frequently spoke at conferences, training sessions, and military installations around the country, always emphasizing that their work had begun not with human planning or institutional support, but with a sick dog's inexplicable determination to fulfill a promise made by someone he had never met to an animal he had never known. The mysterious nature of that original guidance had become less important over the years than the practical results it had achieved and the lives it had touched. But Marcus never forgot the profound sense of being led by forces larger than himself, of participating in something that transcended individual understanding or control. He would tell audiences that while he couldn't explain how Ranger had known exactly where to lead him on that December morning, he could document in precise detail the healing, hope, and purpose that had flowed from that moment of trust and faith in the wisdom of a loyal companion who somehow understood what needed to be done even when his human partner was lost and confused. On quiet evenings at the sanctuary, Marcus would often sit with Ranger on the wide porch of the main building, watching the sun set behind the mountains where Jimmy's cave remained as an eternal testament to promises kept and lives redeemed through service to others. The view from their comfortable chairs encompassed dozens of dogs and their handlers, some permanent residents and others temporary visitors, all connected by their shared understanding of service, sacrifice, loyalty, and the healing power of bonds that transcended species and circumstances. Marcus would tell anyone who asked that Ranger had saved his life as surely as any military working dog had ever saved their handler in combat, leading him not just to life-saving medication, but to a purpose that had transformed grief, isolation, and survivor's guilt into a mission of healing and service that touched thousands of lives every year. The sanctuary now housed the largest collection of military working dog artifacts and historical materials in the country, with Jimmy's original journal serving as the centerpiece of a museum that educated tens of thousands of visitors annually about the history, importance, and ongoing needs of these four-legged veterans who had served their country with the same dedication and courage as their human counterparts. The ripple effects of that fateful December day in the mountains continued to spread years later, touching lives and creating connections that Marcus could never have anticipated when he first followed his sick dog into the forest. Families of fallen handlers found comfort and closure in visiting the sanctuary, seeing concrete evidence that their loved one's service was remembered, honored, and continued through the care provided to their animal partners and the training of new generations of handlers who would carry forward their legacy. Active duty soldiers drew strength and inspiration from meeting retired handlers who had successfully navigated the often difficult transition to civilian life, learning through practical example that purpose and meaning could be found beyond military service, and that the bonds formed in combat could continue to provide support and direction throughout their lives. The sanctuary's veterinary programs had contributed to breakthrough treatments for combat-related trauma in both animals and humans, with research conducted there contributing to medical advances that helped veterans and their animal companions around the world recover from the physical and psychological wounds of service. If you're listening to this story from somewhere in our great nation, know that there are sanctuaries like this one in communities across the country, each one started by veterans who understood the sacred nature of the bond between soldier and working dog, and who committed themselves to ensuring that the promises made in wartime would be honored in peace. The work continues every day, funded by donations from people who believe in the mission and staffed by volunteers who understand that healing comes through service to others who share our struggles and our commitment to keeping faith with those who have served. Perhaps you have your own story of a faithful companion who guided you through dark times, or maybe you know a veteran whose healing journey could be helped by connecting with others who share their experience and understand the weight of the promises they carry. These stories matter because they remind us that service takes many forms, that healing is always possible when we open ourselves to unexpected guidance, and that the bonds forged in the crucible of conflict can become sources of hope and strength for entire communities when we have the courage to honor them properly. Marcus and Ranger's story began with illness, isolation, and the fear of losing yet another companion to circumstances beyond their control, but through trust, determination, and the mysterious wisdom of a dog who somehow knew exactly where he needed to go, it became something far greater than either of them could have imagined when they first set out into that frozen forest. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of loyal companions whose faithfulness and courage changed lives forever. And remember to honor the veterans and their four-legged partners who continue to serve long after their active duty has ended, carrying forward the legacy of promises made and kept through generations of service and sacrifice.